Good morning. Hope everybody's doing well this morning. We've got, well, no, I'm thinking my timing and dates are off because I'm thinking ahead, getting ready to go on a trip. But we do have a few. I was thinking we only had like one more Sunday left before the time jumped forward, which is always bittersweet because I love the longer days. But that first few days is tough when you lose that hour. And people used to tell me when I was just a boy, you won't bounce back so quickly from that one day. It's not as bad as it could be, but I do feel it more now than I used to. We're going to do something a little bit, it's still related to what we've been studying, but we're going to do something a little bit differently because we have, what is today? The 9th. We have next Sunday, which is the 16th, and then the 23rd. And that February ends the quarter, correct? Okay. So, being as I'm going to, I've been humming John Denver all this morning because I'll be leaving on a jet plane soon. But I do know when I'll be back again. But being as I'm going to be doing that, I didn't really want to jump into a new study just yet because basically we would just have maybe enough time to introduce the book, and then I would be going on, and that way we can start our new book on the new quarter. So what I'm going to do today and next week, Lord willing, is to sort of review. I know we've covered a lot of Hebrew history, so I thought that might be profitable to go back and look at these books in an overview fashion, kind of remind us where we've been. I may reference several times the timeline. If you've got your copy that Bob gave out, and I don't have extras here with me now, but we can get those very easily. But I wanted to show you something that I've been saving for just such a time as this, that I think it's just a neat concept, and it's helpful. I think it's helpful to me. I think it'll be helpful to you as well. But it's a periodic table of the books of the Bible. I ran across this. It's been several years, I believe, and I don't. Well, I guess the site there, joshbyers.com, I don't know if that's the fellow that put it together or just where I found it. I actually found this one today, thankfully, because the one I had in my files that I found several years ago was a much lower resolution, and you couldn't see it very well. But it's set up like a periodic table. If you've ever looked at the periodic table in science, most, if not all of us have, at least glanced at it, familiar with it. But this is based on the books of the Bible, and you've got colors down here. You got this. I'm not good with colors, but they all look kind of reddish to me, all those top ones. But you got the Pentateuch is a certain shade. You've got the books of history that are a certain shade. That yellowish color below would be the wisdom literature. Major prophets here, this greenish color, and the blue down here, your minor prophets. Up here, the gospel accounts. And then you've got a book of history here, the book of Acts. So it's that same color as these Old Testament history books. Got Paul's letters with a kind of a goldish color here. This charcoal blackish color would be the more general letters, what we sometimes call the general epistles. And then one book, he's got it listed as apocalyptic. It would be, that's really probably a better term. A lot of people list it as prophecy, and it is. And so I guess apocalyptic is, I guess you could call it a genre. So anyway, some people call it prophecy. Some people just call it simply apocalyptic. Apocalypsis means revelation, hence the name of the book. It's a revealing of what is, what will be, or what has been, what is, and what is to come. We've talked about that. Of course, we're studying that on our Wednesday night class. By the way, somebody help me keep track here of the number. But I was thinking about this today. July 1st, Lord willing, it'll be 8 years that I have worked with the Bremen congregation. And I was looking just recently, and I think Joyce and I had a conversation about this recently. But we have studied. Let's count the books. we just finished 2 Kings, so 7 books here, right? 5, 6, 7, yes. 7 books. We studied the book of Daniel on Wednesday nights some time ago. That's 8. We did all the minor prophets. 8 and 12 is 20. Is that right? Y'all know I don't do math in my head. We studied the book of John on Sunday mornings. That's been a year, maybe 2 years ago. Not that long ago, we completed the book of Acts. I think we finished that last September, maybe. Not that long ago. What is that, 22? 1 Corinthians I preached through a while back, 23. We studied James, 1st and 2nd Peter, and Jude. I believe that was a Sunday morning class. What are we up to? 27? And then we're studying Revelation. So when we finish the book of Revelation, we'll be at 28 books out of the 66 that we have studied. I guess you could say, well, we're not even halfway there, but some of these books we've studied pretty thoroughly, so that's, at some point, I'd like to be able to say that I've taught through and studied through every single book here with the Bremen congregation. So y'all can't be sending me off anywhere anytime soon, because at the rate we're going, it's going to take another 20 years or so, all right? So y'all just, I don't know if that's a... Yeah. So, but anyways, I thought this chart's very helpful. By the way, and I'm going to give you a little bit more zoomed in version, so hopefully you can see a little bit better in just a moment. But if you probably can't read it if you're back very far at all, but this number at the top, of course, on the periodic table, they have all these smaller numbers, and I'm going to confess to you, I don't even remember what those numbers mean. Some of them are like isotopes or something, maybe. I'm not sure. That was a long time ago when I studied the periodic table last. But here in our Bible periodic table, the top number, very top left, that's the number of chapters in the book. And the bottom number just below it is the number of verses. That's, it's just kind of not a big deal, but it's helpful information to have. The top right corner on each book is the date of writing. Now remember, some of these are approximate. We don't know exactly when many of these books were written. But again, helpful information. And then the bottom, you see a name on some of these, or you may not be able to see that. And like I said, we'll zoom in just a moment. But the bottom lists the author. And again, sometimes we know that, sometimes we don't. If we don't know for sure, it's actually got a little harder to see here. I was looking for an example. Here you go. Jeremiah. No, that's not one. Here you go, Hebrews, where he's got several names listed. They're in italics. You probably have a hard time seeing that, but if it's in italics, that means it's the traditional author. This is what tradition tells us. We don't know for certain. Some of these he doesn't have in italics, but they're not traditional. I'm just curious, getting back here where some of you all are. Yeah, it's hard to see. Okay, so let me give you a little bit zoomed in. This is covering Old Testament. We've been studying Old Testament history. What all can you read on that, Mike? Any of those numbers, those smaller ones? Nope. Anybody? Does Mike just have bad eyes, or can nobody else read it either? Nobody else can? Okay. So I was afraid of that. And I have this on file. I can print it for you. I don't know exactly how well it'll print. We could get like the bulletin size paper and print it out for you if you want a paper copy. And we can do that with color on the color printer. Again, somebody might be watching this live stream. I'll be glad to send that to you. I don't know. That's a good question. I bet you can. She asked if we could order it. By the way, Todd, I know your children and some others here do the year-round bulletin boards. I saw when I was looking for this image, I wanted to see if I could find, because like I said, the one I had several years ago is not super good quality. It was kind of blurring when I blew it up this big. So I went and searched for a higher resolution image on Google Images, and I saw where somebody, it was just a church somewhere, they had made a bulletin board out of this. I thought that was pretty cool. So that might be an idea. But yeah, we might be able just to order a copy. But if you, I'll put it this way. When I pasted this image into the PowerPoint, a PowerPoint, this size screen, this is what we call a square screen. It's a 4:3. Some screens are the 16 by 9 widescreen format. But on a square, you have, it's a setting on PowerPoint 10. I don't know if that's supposed to be 10 inches, 10 centimeters. I'm not sure. But anyways, when I pasted the image in, it pasted in at 20 point something. So it's a lot more detailed, higher resolution in file format. We could print it. Like I said, the big bulletin size would probably be readable, but file is the best way to go. And when an image is that high resolution, you can zoom in, way in on the image itself, and you can read those numbers fine. In fact, I could read them even on my lower resolution image, but this one is just way better. So there are your Old Testament books, and then I'm going to zoom in one more time to bring us to the books of Hebrew history that we have been studying, and really the ones that are yet to come. Now, what about that, Mike? Can you read any of those smaller numbers now? Steve, can you read any of those? Elizabeth, Stephen, can y'all read any of those? Okay. So that gets, maybe that's legible. Genesis, of course, you see up here, if you're familiar with Genesis, 50 chapters. That's an interesting fact to know. Genesis has 1,533 verses. So if you're looking to read Genesis, maybe you're doing a class and you say, you know what, I'm going to read Genesis. You know, I want to read through the book by a certain date to get ready for this class or something like that. And so you just, sometimes we divide it up by chapters, but if you study many books of the Bible, you know, sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't, because one chapter may be 89 verses, and then you may have another one that's 20. So sometimes it's a little easier to divide up by verses. That's not always the best, though, because sometimes you end up breaking right in the middle of a chapter, in the middle of a thought, so that's not always the best thing. But, you know, it's interesting information to have. Of course, these are all written by Moses. Some people put, you know, you see the italics here, Joshua on the book of Deuteronomy, because a little small portion of Deuteronomy was written after the death of Moses. But again, as we talked about, we did some overview. I guess it would have been a book of the month. There's no reason why writing by inspiration Moses couldn't have written that. The Pentateuch is all ascribed to Moses. Every time anybody in the New Testament references it, by inspiration, they ascribe it to Moses as far as the human author, human penman, we'll say. God, of course, being the author. Maybe somebody came along, Joshua would be the logical choice and finish that last little bit. I don't know, but there's no reason why, you know, as he's writing by inspiration, Moses couldn't have finished that. So, and by the way, what do we count up? 28 books that we've studied through. That's not even counting, we've done an overview, at least, of every single book of the Bible and the intertestamental period and a harmony of the 4 gospel accounts. And I think we did also threw in there an introduction to the New Testament. I believe there was an introduction to the Old Testament as well in there. So we've covered a lot in 8 years. Do what? Am I running for office? I was just no, I was just thinking about that today, and I was as a preacher, you constantly are trying to think, okay, especially when you're teaching class. For me, when I'm teaching my Wednesday night class, my Sunday morning class, I'm looking at, okay, we've done a book of the Bible here, because sometimes I like to do a topical study, but I don't want to stray too far. Not that topical studies get away from the Bible, but there's nothing to replace being in the text and going sometimes verse by verse through a text, and I like that. So I like to look and say, okay, how am I doing on that? Am I you know, teaching through books of the Bible and not just strictly topical? And then I look at, okay, are we doing a New Testament study versus Old Testament? Old Testament is written for our learning, Romans 15:4, but we also want to make sure that we study plenty in the New Testament, because that's the dispensation, that's the covenant under which we are living. So anyways, these are the books of Hebrew history, and you'll see Moses wrote the Pentateuch. You've got Joshua, probably written by Joshua. Again, same situation at the end of the book of Joshua. You have the death of Joshua recorded. He could have recorded that by inspiration. It might have been finished up by someone like Samuel. And you got 2 Samuel. The prophet Samuel is dead by the end of 2 Samuel. Well, those were originally one book, as you recall. So probably it would have been finished up by someone like Nathan or Gad. These are inspired prophets, so again, you don't run into any kind of issue there as far as inspiration or canonicity. Well, we talked about 1st and 2nd Kings. I don't know if we dealt a whole lot with authorship. Jeremiah is kind of the traditional author. Some people dispute that. Again, we know we're talking human penman, so the evidences of inspiration are there. 1st and 2nd Chronicles, a lot of people think were written by Ezra. And one of the things that would lead you to believe that, among other things, is the heavy reliance on genealogy in the early parts of 1st Chronicles. Again, these were originally one book. A lot of genealogy. Ezra being a scribe, being a priest, he's going to have a lot of knowledge of that. Of course, Ezra, written by Ezra. A lot of folks speculate Ezra wrote Nehemiah. I'm not so sure it wasn't Nehemiah, but there's some sections in there where you wonder is somebody else, and it might be Ezra and Nehemiah. I don't know. We'll talk more about that when we get to that book. Esther, some people speculate Mordecai, or some people pronounce that name Mordecai. May have been Ezra, may have been Nehemiah. Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther all are happening pretty close together as far as chronologically. But I thought that was very interesting, and I'm going to leave that zoomed in portion up while we'll leave that up again next week while we're talking about the kind of reviewing these books. That said, let's talk about Joshua, and let's see what we remember about Joshua. That was a few moons ago, wasn't it? But Joshua is your first book of Hebrew history. Of course, Genesis records a lot of history, and we talked about the book of Genesis before. We didn't study through it verse by verse as we've done some of these other books, but in Genesis, you start with creation, and you cover a few thousand years, and then Genesis just sort of slams on the brakes a little over halfway through. I mean, you're just flying through history. In fact, some scholars speculate that just up to the time of the flood may have been, well, we know it was several hundred years, because you've got Methuselah, he's the oldest man, right? And if you do the math, and I'm not as good with numbers as some folks are, but when you do the figuring up with the numbers and all, Methuselah died the year the flood came. So it seems he died in the flood. It may be that he died, at 969 years old, just happened to die the same year of the flood. But his death came in the year of the flood. So it had been at least 969 years, right? And there were other generations before. So we're talking a few thousand years just to Genesis 6. But does anybody remember where in Genesis, by the way, that kind of, as we use the term, slams on the brakes? Because you go from just leaps and bounds of history in time, and it just stops. It doesn't just stop, but it's advancing much more slowly. And you see this pretty much throughout the rest of the Bible. It's right around the time of a certain gentleman, Abraham. You see this in Genesis 12, and really even with Abraham, it slows down, but you're still going at a pretty good clip. It's when you get to another descendant of Abraham. There's Abraham, who's his son? Isaac, Jacob, and then where is it that it's the son of Jacob? Yeah, it's Joseph. Genesis 37. I mean, it's just like the narrative comes to a screeching halt, and it says, okay, we're going to park it here on Joseph. Genesis 37 all the way through 50. And you really get a lot of detail about Joseph. Now you start to see God is going to show us in great detail the unfolding of his scheme of redemption, how the Messiah is going to come, through whom the Messiah is going to come. We've already been told through the seed of woman, but it's going to be a lot more detail. And it's around Genesis, don't quote me on this, 30-ish, 32 maybe. There's a text that lists Oh, it's 36. It's right before 37. That would have been the logical choice. It's Genesis 36. It's going to list these dukes, as they're called in the King James, but it's the generations of Esau. But at that point, it's not that the narrative ignores other people, but at that point you have so much focus on the descendants of Abraham. And the text focuses on them not because God loves them more, not because God doesn't care about the other people, but it's because that is the family, the line, the lineage through whom the Messiah will come. And you'll see dealings with Gentiles. In fact, we see it just in this section of Hebrew history. But you really see a focus on them. And, of course, you come to Exodus, things are very different for the nation of Israel. When Genesis closes, everything's great. Jacob has come to, he thought his son Joseph was dead. He finds out he's alive. He comes to Egypt. He says, let me die in peace. I never would have thought I'd ever see my boy again. I've seen him. I can die a happy man is basically what he's saying. And he lives for a few more years. He dies. They bury him. And when Genesis closes, when the curtain falls, as we say, on the book of Genesis, man, things are great for Israel. But then there arises a new king, a new Pharaoh in Egypt. He doesn't know Joseph. Joseph's dead by this point. And he decides, you know what, these people, they're multiplying, and they're becoming so numerous, and somebody's going to come along. Why did he think this? I don't know. Sometimes there's a psychological concept where sometimes we assume in others what we would do ourselves. Somebody says, well, I know what you meant by that. Sometimes that's what I would have meant by that, and that's what I'm projecting onto someone else. I wonder if this Pharaoh, he's the kind of fellow that, he would just join up with an enemy or something. I don't know. I'm just speculating, of course, but it makes you wonder, why did he just assume that because they were numerous, if you treat these people right, why would they not be friends with you? Why would they join up with an enemy? Whatever reason, he decides he needs to make them his slaves. And so he did, and they cried out to God. God remembers his covenant. And, of course, Moses grows up. Pharaoh wants to kill the babies, and no doubt did kill a number of the Hebrew male children. Moses was hidden. He's ends up being brought up by his mother as a nurse, because Pharaoh's daughter found him, of course, in the bulrushes, in the reeds there in the river, the Nile River. He sees an Egyptian picking on a Hebrew. He steps in, kills the Egyptian, buries him in the sand. The next day, he sees two Hebrew men fighting. Hey, you guys break it up. You're brethren. And one fellow says, what, are you going to kill me like you killed that Egyptian yesterday? Now Moses says, uh-oh, this thing is known. So he leaves. 40 years in the wilderness. He meets, not Jochebed, that was his mother. Zipporah, thank you. He meets Zipporah. Jethro, her father, becomes Moses' father-in-law. He's keeping sheep for his father-in-law, tending sheep out in the wilderness. He sees this side of burning bush, and the bush is burning, but it's not consumed. By the way, we've been kind of in this section for our Bible time at home, and I don't know who all's teaching my 3-year-old, but even my 3-year-old, he's on top of it. We've been talking about the burning bush, and he could tell you it just kept on burning. That's what he says. I was trying to. I can't always understand him. I have to sometimes get Austin to translate, but and Austin can. He can say anything, and Austin will say, "Oh, what he said was, how'd you get that from that?" But he was saying something, and I was thinking to myself, the bush wasn't consumed, it wasn't burned up, but they say it just keeps on burning. And so he kept saying something. What? And finally, Austin says, he said it keeps on burning. Oh, okay. Well, yeah, that's right. So he sees this bush. It's not being consumed, even though it's on fire. He says, I'm going to go see what this is about. And he gets close. And again, 3-year-old, 4-year-old, they can tell me. God says, take off your shoes, Moses. You're on holy ground. And so God commissions Moses to lead them out of Egypt. And that's, of course, the better part of the book of Exodus. They arrive at Mount Sinai. They receive the law. Last several chapters of the book of Exodus are, details pertaining to the tabernacle. They're going to build this tabernacle, a portable house or tent of worship. Leviticus all takes place at Mount Sinai. They're going to be there about a year. And Leviticus is special laws for the Levites, but it's also some laws in there for the entire nation. Numbers, they're getting ready to leave Mount Sinai, but before they do, they number the people, hence the name. They take a census, we might say. 603,550 males 20 years old and upward who are able to go forth to war. They do this again at the end of the book. The numbering at the beginning and at the end, of course, is where we get the name. In between, they are supposed to be going into the promised land. They send out, Moses, at God's behest, sends out the 12 spies. 10 of them come back, give an evil report. We can't take the land. There are giants there. We're grasshoppers in their sight. We're going to be crushed. 2 of them, who were Joshua and Caleb, they say, no, we can take the land. God's with us. If he's for us, nobody can stand before us. Don't disbelieve God and bring more trouble upon us. But they didn't listen. They listened to the 10 unfaithful spies. And so 40 years, a year for each day that the spies were in the land spying out the land, they're going to be wandering in the wilderness until that faithless generation died out. But even in spite of that, in spite of their disobedience, God cared for them in the wilderness. But that unbelieving generation was not going into the promised land. So Numbers covers the better part, really about 38, 39 years of that wilderness wandering. Deuteronomy is the repeating of the law for that new generation. They're just right on the cusp of entering into the promised land. In fact, Numbers, and Deuteronomy details it a little bit too, gets you some of the what we call the Transjordan. It's on the eastern side of the Jordan River. They did conquer some people there, getting ready to cross the Jordan into what we call the promised land proper. And so when you get to the book of Joshua, this is what Joshua's all about. It's conquest and possession. It's that period of conquest, conquering the land, possessing the land. Israel conquers, then they possess the land. In general, it begins with crossing the Jordan River. Of course, remember, God stopped the river. They crossed on dry land, chapter 3. And the book will end with the death of Joshua. So it's a pretty easy book as far as remembering. If you remember the name of the book, then you know at least what happens at the very end. At the very beginning, Joshua takes over. At the very end, Joshua dies. The events in the book of Joshua, as you recall, take place over a period of about 25 years. It's not a long period of time. It's not as short as Leviticus. Remember, Leviticus was just 1 year at Mount Sinai. It's about 25 years. The purposes of the book of Joshua, then this is kind of where we want to really review to remember the purpose of the book. Why is this in the Bible? Well, it tells us about the fulfillment of the land promise that God made to Abraham. Sometimes you'll hear people talk about some people may not know what the word premillennialism means, but they know the concept. And sometimes one of the key concepts is we have to support Israel, we have to help Israel. And of course, my disclaimer that I always give, I'm not against helping the nation of Israel. They're far more in line with the interests of the United States politically and otherwise than the Islamic states are. That's just a fact. And they're going to be advocates of allowing us to worship and serve our God in the way prescribed in His Word. Whereas you align yourself with that Muslim concept, mentality, it does not allow for that. And you can say what you want, but you can read their book, and it's not there. It's not a peaceful thing. That's my disclaimer. However, we shouldn't be running around trying to push support for Israel on a religious basis. And the idea there is, well, we got to support them because that's God's people, and one day they're going to go back and they're going to take that land and fulfill that land promise. Well, the book of Joshua tells us in no uncertain terms that God fulfilled His land promise to Abraham. They possessed all the land God had promised. And so there's nothing left to fulfill. God's dealings physically with the physical nation of Israel ended in AD 70. Israel still is the people of God, but it's spiritual Israel, and that's what you have to remember. And spiritual Israel it's the church of Jesus Christ. Galatians 6:16 talks about the Israel of God. That's the church. Brother Steve, you were going to say something? Yes. And that's Deuteronomy. I mean, Moses says it over and over. In fact, he predicts the captivity he prophesies a number of things that came to pass, because he says if you get in the land, you got these vineyards you didn't plant, gardens you didn't plant, houses you didn't build, and you get, I'm paraphrasing, but he says you get spiritually lazy, here's what's going to happen. And that's exactly what happened, and the things that were prophesied came to pass. I think wasn't it Nixon's Secretary of State, Kissinger? Was that the guy? I mean, it was like a whole policy that was in large part based on premillennialism, the idea that Israel had rights spiritually to that land. And it's just not biblical. There's again, I want Israel to have that land, the state of Israel, for other reasons, because I want to continue to live in a country where I'm free to serve my God as he tells me to do, and not to be persecuted for it. But it has nothing to do with, well, that's God's people, that's their land by right from the Bible and things like that. So that's one of the main purposes of Joshua. It shows the land promise was fulfilled. It also records the history of Israel after the death of Moses. I mean, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. You've got Moses is the, at least Exodus through Deuteronomy, Moses is the central character. Even with Genesis, Moses is inspired to go back and write from the very beginning of time a history and to tell us what happened. Well, what happened after Moses died? Well, Joshua is going to answer that. It also is written to record the victories of God and Israel in the land of Canaan. They conquered by faith. And there's spiritual lessons there as well, of course. Outline of the book, just a very brief outline. The first 12 chapters, this is the conquest of the land of Canaan, the promised land. Then you have chapters 13 through 22 is the division of the land. Once they conquered the land, then they divided it up by tribes. That's chapters 13 through 22. And then chapters 23 and 24 are Joshua's farewell address to the nation. He knows he's nearing the end of his time on earth. Wow, we're still in Joshua. He's nearing the end of his time on earth, so he gives a farewell address to the people. As far as important people in the book, Joshua's important, obviously. Caleb. And Caleb's going to he's going to come to Joshua at one point and say, give me this mountain, because Joshua and Caleb are the only two people from that previous generation to go into the land of Canaan. He's going to say, give me this mountain. So Caleb's an important person. Rahab, she hid the spies, and she believed in God, and she turned to God and turned away from idols, and so they spared her and her family. Achan, why is Achan an important person in this section, in this book? Yeah, and Jericho was the first city that they conquered. This was the first fruits. And what happens with first fruits? They go to God. Achan decided, I want some of this. And you may recall, I've said it numerous times, and when I've taught this book, on into the book of Joshua, after he divides the inheritance, he sends the people to their inheritance, and he says, now go and enjoy all the fruits of this conquest. And if Achan had just waited, if he had just waited and given God the first fruits, given God what was rightfully his, we're just stewards. If he had just waited a little bit, he would have heard Joshua say, now go and take all this bounty and enjoy and live your life serving God faithfully. But he didn't. And so Achan ended up dying. Of course, you recall there was sin in the camp, so they lost the battle at Ai. In fact, it's the only battle they lost, right? They won every battle because God was with them, except for one, and that was Ai, because there was sin in the camp. And God tells Moses, not Moses, Joshua. Joshua fell on his face. Oh, Lord, what are we going to do? What are people going to say? You brought us into this land, and now we can't take it. God says, get up, Joshua. There's sin in the camp. And so they took care of that, and they went back to conquering. Eleazar's another important person here. He'll take over as the high priest when Aaron dies. Let's move on. There was something else I had in my notes that I wanted to... by the way, the promised land was like a rest for the children of Israel. It's typical of our heavenly rest. Hebrews writer will connect that over in the New Testament book of Hebrews. Immediately after they enter into the land of Canaan, three things happen. They circumcised the males, number one. Number two, they kept the Passover. And number three, they stopped eating manna. Remember, the manna stopped right before they went into the promised land. I thought there was something else I had here. Where did the tabernacle end up being put at this point? It's going to stay there for a while, for a good long while. I thought I heard somebody say it. Did you say Shiloh? Shiloh. It'll be at Shiloh, and then it'll later move, but for a long, long time it stays there. The Levites did not receive land, you recall, but they did receive 48 Levitical cities dispersed among the nation, because the Levites were to teach God's word, you recall. They also, included in those 48 cities, were 6 cities of refuge, in case someone accidentally killed another to flee from the avenger of blood. And so Israel served God all the days of Joshua and all the days of the men who outlived Joshua. So Joshua was a tremendous leader. Then you get to the book of Judges. I know we're short on time. We won't get far into the book of Judges. We'll just jump right into it next week. But I did want to mention something. I think I got time for this. A contrast, and I found this I was going back and looking at my book of the month notes. I'm going to compare Joshua and Judges, and you see such a contrast in these two books. In Joshua, you have what's basically amounts to a song of joy. It tells of the victory of God's people during their days of faithfulness. I mean, it's just victory, victory, victory. Ai has that one hiccup, and it came pretty early on, but after that, it's just win, 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 win. They were just defeating their foes right and left. They come into the land. They divide the land up. Joshua says, go home, enjoy all these blessings God has given you. It's just wonderful. Judges is one of the saddest books in the Bible. It tells of Israel's disobedience, their departure from God, and many times their utter defeat. Joshua is a book of progress. Judges is a book of decline. Joshua is a book of possession of the land. Judges is a book of oppression in the land. They're in the land, but they're being oppressed many times. Joshua is a book of faith. Judges is a book of unbelief, lack of faith. Joshua is a book of freedom. Judges is a book of bondage. Many times they're in bondage to heathen people because they're not serving God. Joshua is a book about the certainty of God's promises. Judges is a book about the certainty of God's warnings. He warned them what would happen if they didn't listen, if they didn't follow God faithfully. And when we get into the book of Judges, we see that. We'll move a little. We won't spend as much time on this chart, obviously, next week, but we'll do a quick review of Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. That'll get us, we don't need to do as much review on 1st and 2nd Kings, I wouldn't think anyways, because we've covered those more recently. And then that'll get us ready to go into our next section there of Hebrew history as we talk about the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Really, the book of Chronicles is what it is. It was divided later on. But like 1st and 2nd Samuel, like 1st and 2nd Kings, it was originally one book. But that'll get us ready next week. We'll do that review and get us ready to go into our next area of study. So thank you. We'll have a break before our worship. I hope the review is helpful to you. I know it's helpful to me to go back and remember where we've been and refresh our memory. Thank you.